welcome Marion Demossier, a professor of social and cultural anthropology at the University of Southampton and a member of the OIV, who's going to speak to us. You have the microphone here. Just waiting for my slides. And I've got a dual challenge in front of me to try to keep you awake. And also to try in a slightly provocative manner, because I'm an anthropologist. In anthropology, we do like to dig into things and ask the awkward questions. And in doing so, I'm going to try to offer some form of conclusion. I'd like to thank, of course, the Cité du Vin, particularly the organizers, for all the work that's gone into organizing today, and also the president for chairing today's proceedings. And I'd like to say just how much I found today's contributions, all of them, important in the ongoing debate and our efforts to generate new forms of knowledge. And as just been highlighted by the last question that was asked, I think it's extremely important today, these new forms of knowledge, because in the political and economic climate, social climate also in which we live, trying to come up with new ideas which go beyond wine, beyond the world of wine, and it's important. I think we need to think bigger, and that's what I'm going to try to do with my concluding. Right, here we are. I wrote about 4 pages, but I think I'll avoid reading it out for you. I'm just going to touch upon a certain number of points. I'd like to thank Christelle and Gaspar as well, because I think they really teed me up nicely. I think you've really made my task easier, because I feel there's a theme which has run throughout all of the presentations we've heard today. It might not have always been obvious, but I think it underlies everything, and that it's the theme of plurality. And that's the first slightly provocative element of my presentation. I want to quote Thomas Eland Eriksson, who unfortunately passed away just a few months ago, professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo, and describes modern society as a world which is overheated. The metaphor he uses to show the acceleration since the 1990s, acceleration of changes driven by globalization. You've all talked about it in very different ways. You all talked about Europeanization. I heard globalization. What's interesting in Eriksson's definition of overheating is that this acceleration of our society is getting faster. It's becoming more pronounced, it's becoming more intense, more unstable, and in some cases more violent. We could talk about climate change, but this goes beyond that. Think also about the crises racking contemporary capitalism, and also the Trumpist phenomenon, and the rise of the certain trends in our politics. So how does this intense globalization, this compression operate? Well, it feels that time is getting shorter and space is getting smaller. It's the effect of compression. But wine is something different in this context. Wine has a different relationship to space. There's a plurality of spaces, a plurality of experiences, and also in a relationship to time. Some of you have already mentioned religion, the religious overtones of wines. There is obviously a decline in religion in many of our Western societies. Younger generations are increasingly unlikely to go to church, but the rituals associated with consumption are very important. And anthropologists are very interested in this question of ritual, because it's the way that the ritualization of the different wines requiring different glasses, all the expertise you need to have. There is a ritual aspect to all that, which really contrasts with Eriksson's definition of overheating and everything being so fast these days. There's also another elephant in the room, if you will, and that's the question of the digital world, digital tools. You talked a lot about it in that consumer study we just heard of, but digital tools these days, maybe not for my generation, but for the generation of the students who I'm teaching now, digital is constantly with you. The digital world is with you forever. Even if they're in lectures, they've got the telephone next to them, it might be translating stuff automatically, it might be writing on it. Digital tools are never out of their hands. With a certain amount of positive benefits of ever having the social media tools, for example, but some bad things. I mean, in the UK, in England, we've never, in my university, we've never had so many students with mental health difficulties. And that's a byproduct of the modern world in which we live. So in this world of rupture, of discontinuity, described by Erickson, wine is an object which is fundamentally sensitive to the social context in which it exists, and wine is not immune to this instability. Maybe wine is also overheating. But the history of wine in relation to other food and drink products, wine remains a social force, for sociability, an opportunity to reflect upon the world in which we live. It's one of the rare categories where globalization has been challenged, questioned. You know, France is a really interesting social laboratory in this respect. You have these different trends in wine, organic wines, natural wines, wines with all these different labels, different ways of it. And you know, people from other countries find it difficult to understand what's going in sometimes. But I do think, you know, wine in France and wine is a wonderful laboratory of new ideas. And what's interesting about all that is in all of the speeches that we've heard today, there are two things which I find a little bit difficult. Culture. As an anthropologist, the term culture, you know, wine and culture, culture and wine, for us, everything is culture. Wine is a social and cultural construct and a phenomenon. And I was wondering, was there not perhaps another way, a more useful way of looking at it? Ultimately, instead of saying that, is there a future for wine without culture? I mean, for an anthropologist, the answer that there's contradiction in terms, because there is no wine without culture, therefore forcibly, ultimately linked. Perhaps the better question is, what is wine today? What does wine mean in the worlds in which we live? There was a presentation this morning which got close to that sort of approach to looking at wine. So we as anthropologists, we're also always a little bit cagey about using the term culture. I invite you to read Philippe Descola and Bruno Latour also. Read Bruno Latour. You see that the cultures of culture versus nature, those are artificial divisions, and they're problematic concepts in modern anthropology. I'm sorry, we have our own jargon, like all sector, like all academic disciplines, but in modern anthropology, doing away with the artificial distinction between culture and nature helps us to more precisely, more accurately observe through closer immersion with a more of an ethnographic, sensorial approach, the complexity which lies beneath a term as such catch-all terms as culture. And I'm not going to give you a whole anthropology lecture today. That's not what I'm here for, but I do invite you to think more carefully about social relations, the concepts of agency, who does what, who drives consumption, how do consumers respond, for example, interiority, what are the internal worlds, how do consumers internalize the models to which they're presented. The European model, the French model, is a very sophisticated model, a very sophisticated approach to wine in many other countries. That makes no sense. People find that very difficult to understand the codes. And finally, the idea of transcending the dichotomy between culture and nature is important, because nature produces culture and culture produces nature. And I wanted to revisit these themes through the lens of the three big themes talked about today: wine as a globalized culture, not just in France, but wine as a facet and as a feature of culture, and the enormous continuous cultural exchange which is going on at a global level, and the role that wine occupies in that culture. I have a very positive impression of the role of wine in all that. And there's also the question of plurality, which, as I mentioned, is particularly important for me. You know, there is standardization. UNESCO is a force of mission, quality labels. There are many other channels to which standardization, uniformization, opposite. We need to maintain the plurality of our society, because the more plural, the more multifarious, multifaceted we can be, then the more capable we are to adapt, to be resilient in the face of crises. So on the first subject, wine as a culture, social, of globalized social and cultural product, wine remains deeply rooted in the construction of the identity of our regional, national, and international spaces and a certain understanding of what it means of what locality means and how local identities are formed. That's very important about when I talk about the creation of the formation of local identities. This has been very well described in the most recent presentation. It's about the identification with things, with the imaginary side of things, but also in forms of praxis, drinking, eating, talking, concrete things, visiting places, seeing landscapes, visiting the architecture of wine regions. There's a whole constellation of practices at work there. Historically, it's worth bearing in mind that the nation states in Europe have chosen wine as a territorial marker, an emblem of their civilization, as a means of consolidating their diplomatic relations. That was highlighted this morning. But of course, we should not forget that many critics of the terroir model have demonstrated that the people's wine interest for objects and consumer goods which are rooted in places and born of the increasingly intense and globalized circulation of people and foods since the 19th century, with emigration from Europe and, of course, in the 20th century. So I would cite Rebecca Feinberg, for example, who's did a lot of work on Italian sparkling wines, particularly Prosecco, saying that the development of the raw materials such as wine with unique flavors, that's not the only driving force. So the development of wine is also largely driven by the development and the spread of humans and the continued processes by which our tastes are reshaped constantly. Second point, with wine as a social, cultural, globalized product, I think there's really important to move beyond existing image of wine, to reach people through a former relationship which is commensurate with and compatible with the world in which they live, defining a new world, new worlds of wines, where wine exists. You can't always predict precisely where exactly the future is going to take wine, but the more models we offer, the more varied and diverse the offering, the greater the possibility for wine to occupy different spaces, different worlds. That requires a multiplicity of stories, of narratives, of commitments, and I think that is particularly every bit as important as the question of image. So there's been a democratization, and wine is more accessible and open, and the transformation of wine culture, powered and accompanied by the digital revolution, in difficulty. In the UK, for example, some of the big stars of wine culture, I won't name them, but they're very well represented internationally. They're really fallen out of favor on social media. People say, who cares about this and wine? This, what these influencers, that model is starting to seem obsolete for new, younger consumers. However, as this process of democratic opening has gone through, powered by digital technologies, we've also seen, and this is particularly evident since COVID. I mean, we haven't talked much about COVID, but COVID was really a massive shift and really upended a lot of assumptions. And particularly in the UK, there's been a boom of small social networks which who have encouraged young people, and this is there were tasting groups, students, 5, 10, and they get together to taste wine and talk about it. These kind of phenomena which are really unexpected, which is just go to show that there are things happening which were unpredictable, but they're happening. It's also important to highlight the fact that wine remains a foodstuff, and there is a hierarchy to foodstuffs. We live in a world where the hierarchies are constantly being challenged. We're attempting to resist, in some cases, the impact of the new hierarchies, but at the same time, wine provides a forum, a space for reflection on those forms of traditional hierarchies and these new and emerging hierarchies. Wine is not a neutral space. It is very often a mirror to the society in which it exists more broadly. And I think that's a positive factor. Third point, very briefly, because we've actually heard quite a lot about this already today. So since the 1970s, there's been a very strong environmental movement, a strong movement in favor of increasing quality. And we know that we're living in a world which is at a turning point for many reasons, and which requires us, demands that we rethink our understanding of wine as a product and the contribution it has to make to the environmental turn in our society. I could cite an example of the Scandinavian markets. I'm thinking particularly of, well, Scandinavia in general, where wine consumption is on the up. Wines cost quite a lot of money in many Scandinavian countries, or in Japan also. Japan has adopted wine as part of its national identity, and also in the UK, it's interesting. There's been quite a strong change, a strong trend in the UK in favor of regenerative viticulture, and that's caused me to rethink wine tourism, which is also part of an effort to remodel a culture of alcoholic consumption, which is excessive. And this is also interesting because for many students, they associate wine with a bottle of rosé, an Echo Falls bottle of rosé, which doesn't cost very much, crap wine, and they knock it back really quickly before they go out to get themselves drunk before they go out. They might even be taking drugs to get messed up to make it easier to talk to people, and might even go further than that. And all the things that students, how students construct their sociability, to put it mildly. Second major theme, and I will be quick with this, to leave a little, to try and stick to the time that's been allotted to me. The idea of wine, so it's culture, it's representative of culture and of place. And here I want to take my argument a little bit further. So in parallel to this territorialization of wine culture, the rooting of wine in the place, AOCs, geographical origin, etc. At the same time, there's been a deterritorialization which is taking root. And that's of its crucial importance, particularly in the way that people consume, the way that people think about products like wine. For anthropologists, the spatial dimension, which is specific to wine and vines, is constitutive of social identity. This is Depardieu, not Depardieu. On one hand, there was a localization, a territorialization of production and consumption of wine, but on the other hand, we're witnessing a real deterritorialization, a delocalization, which chimes with a broader change in the balance between rural and urban. Thank you very much, Marion, for your question about the contrast between rural and urban areas. By 2050, more than 70% of the world's population will live in towns and cities. You need to bear that in mind. And also, we know in cities, there's a strong percentage now of people living alone, singles. And so with new forms of digital communication, relations between people are being constantly buffed and affected. I regularly take the train. You go up in the wagon, even in France, you get in the train. People don't talk anymore. Everybody's staring down at their little screen. Their life seems to take place through that little screen. They forget to look where they're going. They just forget to look up and look around them and engage with the other people around them. So I'd really like, in this social imaginaries they're talking about, we need to think about creating spaces which protect and preserve our humanity, what's left of it. The other point, I want to talk about the anthropologists working on wine seem to go beyond this idea of permanence, which the landscape and the architecture and winemaker, they like to share this image of permanence. It's more interesting to think of the dynamics, the social cultural dynamics of reshaping the world of wine. Christel and Gaspard highlighted this very neatly. This idea of experience, also the sharing, the winemaking. There are many people all over the world who are leaving their jobs at in banks or whatever to become wine growers, winemakers. That is an important phenomenon. So there are some quite interesting work being done on this. the cultural reification, the process of reification, how it attaches certain characteristics of local winemaking to protect and ring fence it against change. If you say UNESCO has played a role in that process, but if we continue to just protect and ring fence and showcase these UNESCO sites, then the economic dimension, it becomes completely forgotten. And because rarity is an important commodity, the rarer something is, then the more desirable it is. So you need to be careful about that. You think about the importance of protecting heritage, but that heritage must have a collective, must be beneficial in the greater interest of the collective at a bigger level. There's some great examples this afternoon of the initiative to rethink approaches to wine, to do things collectively together and open up new horizons. I mean, it's really, really interesting examples. So differential values associated with wines express multiple ontologies, diverse views of the world, and diverse cultural practices which have grown up around a drink which is broadly spread and enjoyed around the world. We need to continue to nurture the plurality of digestion. And there's another example which is given by you're talking about grape varieties. I think that's one way of putting into this, because nature, our relationship to plants, the relationship to humans and non-humans. We haven't talked a lot about the animals, the bees and all the other beings that come into play. And we can perhaps rethink about wine as a force of life, of the imaginary of life, and an opportunity to live, to breathe, not to die too young. So I think there are some really fundamental elements. And I will conclude. I don't know if I've gone over my allocated time. No one's sleeping, I don't think. There you go. The new imaginary, the new images and imaginaries of wine. I will insist once again on this idea of plurality, which I must admit I borrowed from a wonderful book by Marion, the anthropological use of Paris. It's becoming heteronormative. On the plurality of the world, which I really found very inspirational. The Mariani, this name was, and he talks a lot about the wine growing heritage of the world, and talks about the possibility of opening up to natural wines and raw wines. And but reading through that a little bit, what the heteronormative? Well, yeah, I mean that's completely applicable to wine. We need to protect and defend the plurality of the worlds of wine. So you have we have the Cité du Vin, and the iconography of this place is an excellent example of what can be done of wine, of championing wine as a foodstuff, as a source of calories. For a long time, wine was synonymous with Judeo-Christian history. But don't forget that some of the finest poems of Sufi Islam and the Sunnite Islam are inspired by wine also. It's not just Judeo-Christian things, but consumer habits since the antiquity of the long history have radically changed, of course. And our cultures are much more transnational. In 2010, I wrote a book on the history of wine in France, and I had a lot of trouble finding wine drinkers. So I decided to use the term in English, to sum it up in English. Wandering drinker is the term we came with. The idea of a drinker who's goes from here to there. This was me at the time. I was sort of wandering at the time. I was born in a winemaking family community, but I thought it was interesting to think about consumer practices, consumer habits, and consumer experiences reflect the preoccupations and the debates of contemporary societies. Today, of course, things have changed and exploded and beyond the recognition. But digital technologies back then were really in their early days, particularly social media. I think I still didn't have the internet on my telephone back then. I've already forgotten the idea of having a phone without internet, but unfortunately, that's how it is. So wine has now become a drink which is widely consumed all around the world, and wines are produced far beyond the confines of Europe and its old empires. America, Australia, South America, and there's a real buzz from new wine consuming nations. You go to New Zealand, which is a fantastic country, the gastronomy and wine constantly being elevated and celebrated. There really is a positive buzz around the social connections that are still around. And there's a young audience, a young public, a lot of young people interested in wine and gastronomy, and young women, notably. So it's not a model which is completely bound for extinction. Its transmission is important, but its transmission hasn't disappeared, hasn't broken down. It's changing. The way that we pass these things on, the way that young people identify with and engage with doing this transmission, their behaviors are changed. They're more difficult to grasp. But I have two daughters. I've got one who's 28 and one's 18, and I can say that at home they're fed up with me talking about wine. Neither of my daughters drinks wine. Ultimately, well, the elder drank a bit of that cheap rosé while she was a student, but the idea of their gastronomic and enological culture, despite all of the work that we've done at home trying to pass that on, very difficult to really get into those young people's bubbles these days. So yeah, there is a certain tribalness to it. A new form of subjectivation. It's also reshaping consumers with the emergence of women as new consumers and also the visibility of those new consumers in the professional sector. It's wonderful to see more and more women now in the wine industry playing important roles and being acting as the spokespeople for wine, for wine consuming. I remember very well when I started working researching wine, there's some of my colleagues even now say to me, you drink a lot, don't you? I said, well, no, I drink less and less, actually. It's not that, I'm not studying wine because I want to drink more wine. What I'm interested in what goes with it or in all the world around it. But there are a certain number of obstacles to our improving our understanding, to understanding the fundamental role that wine can play in France. If you imagine what the landscape would look like without a winemaking village, what on earth would the country look like? And in certain respects, it's hard to imagine for wine. It's hard to imagine wine without all the cultural trappings and forms that are associated with it. I would like to finish on a positive note by saying that the French, the European model of wine, is true also of Spain and Italy. They play an important role in this. It's been copied all over the world. It's a source of inspiration. There is perhaps a certain amount of jealousy even. But I think there's a lot of admiration worldwide for this culture, this model of wine. I recently visited the Carlsberg Brewery. They've got a big problem with declining beer consumption, actually. They're losing a lot of market share at Carlsberg. Particularly the person I was working with just been fired. He got sacked from one day to the next. He was the marketing director of Carlsberg. They just sacked him pretty abruptly. But last year when I was visiting the Carlsberg brewery with him, we had a great tasting session. He tasted of their wine range. I felt like I was in Burgundy tasting all these wines. All the protocol was there, all the format, and the brewer, there's a slightly truculent fellow, was there telling us about how to taste beer and saying all the work that he did with his Alchemist. They have a restaurant called the Alchemist, about 600 euros for dinner. By the way, that's in Copenhagen. It's hard to get a table, but 600 euros dinner. They have a beer slash wine. A beer wine is 350 euros a bottle. So it's very interesting. Things are changing. There are complex phenomena emerging, taking shape, and transforming our idea of what wine can be. So I think we can say that wine these days is becoming a significant, an interesting object for studying the form, the propagation, the emergence, and the spread of new social configurations. At a time of major historical changes, obviously there are tensions between the idea of wine as an alcohol, of course. So we've talked a lot about wine as alcohol, but there's a contrast there that comes out of wine as a cultural object or phenomenon. Never forget that Donald Trump only drinks Coca-Cola. That gives you perhaps what does that tell you about him anyway? And of course, it's the subject of continuous debate, but I think wine has really advantages. Certainly aces up its sleeve. Wine is not any old alcohol. It's not an alcohol like any other. Obviously, it contains alcohol, but there is a long history behind wine, and it offers a certain number of horizons, historic and social, and all the other associations that we have with wine. I think I should probably finish now. I'm sure that you're probably thirsty. So, in conclusion, the overheating, conceptualized by Erickson, as I mentioned in my introduction, can help us to rethink what wine is, what it's becoming, and what it means, what it signifies in our contemporary society. Wine has been with us for more than 8,000 years. The accidental discovery of fermentation has become an industry, an art, a science influenced by human history. And obviously, Europe has played a central role in that process. The creativity, the innovation of wine. Wine does not exist in isolation. It exists because it is intimately connected to humanity, to humans and non-humans, but also structured by new practices, new experiences, new narratives, new commitments. Ultimately, whatever the future, I'm very optimistic about the future of wine. Wine will always remain deeply rooted into the history of humanity, and I will continue. I'll conclude now with this idea of wine as a relationship, something that accompanies us, that we meet, that we evolve together in parallel. Wine is a way of better understanding what it means to be human today in the 21st century. And that's the end. Thank you very much for your patience.